Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Tuesday, 17 September 2024. It is the 281st anniversary of the birth of Marie Jean Antoine Nicolas de Caritat, also known as the Marquis of Condorcet, and usually known to posterity simply as Condorcet. Condorcet was born in Ribemont in Picardy on this date in 1743. In my episode on Herder, I quoted Arthur Lovejoy, who wrote an essay on what he called the progressivist philosophies of history in the late 18th century by Lessing, Herder, Kant, and Schiller. In that essay, Lovejoy only considered Germanophone philosophers, but at the same time as these Germanophone philosophers were working on their progressivist philosophies of history, Voltaire, Turgot, Condorcet, and Guizot were also formulating progressivist philosophies at about the same time in France. Also about at the same time, Joseph de Maistre, Alexis de Tocqueville, and Arthur de Gobineau were formulating their own philosophies of history, but I wouldn't call these efforts progressivist, although they were happening in roughly across the same period of time. Joseph de Maistre is probably the best instance of a reactionary that has ever drawn breath. So he's pretty much everything that these progressivist philosophers of history opposed. Condorcet then belonged with the previous tradition of French philosophy of history, originating in Voltaire, who was the first person to explicitly call philosophy of history, and then passing through Turgot to Condorcet, and then from Condorcet to Guizot. Almost a half century before Condorcet wrote his sketch for a historical picture of the progress of the human mind, Turgot wrote a philosophical review of the successive advances of the human mind, published in 1750. In this work, Turgot wrote, quote, "At last all the shadows are dispelled, and what a light shines out on all sides. What a host of great men in every sphere. What a perfection of human reason. One man, Newton, has subjected the infinite to the calculus, has revealed the properties of light which, illuminating everything, seemed to conceal itself, and has put into his balance the stars, the earth, and all the forces of nature. And this man has found a rival. Leibniz encompasses within his vast intellect all the objects of the human mind. The different sciences, confined at first to a small number of simple notions common to all, can no longer, when as a result of their progress they have become more extensive and more difficult, be envisioned otherwise than separately. But greater progress once again unites them, because there is discovered that mutual dependence of all truth, which in linking them together illuminates each through the other. Because if each day adds to the vast extent of the sciences, each day also makes them easier, because methods are multiplied with discoveries, because the scaffolding rises with the building," unquote. Turgot also wrote an essay on universal history, another favorite theme of the Enlightenment, in which he predicted the indefinite advancement of scientific knowledge. Condorcet took up both of these themes found earlier in Turgot, and he extended them. And after Condorcet, Guizot wrote History of Civilization in Europe based on lectures that he delivered at the Sorbonne. For those who tend to associate the so-called cult of progress with 19th century England, Guizot is a revelation to read, since Guizot defines civilization in terms of progress in 4 thought experiments in the first chapter of History of Civilization in Europe. There is a sense then in which Guizot is a continuator of the project of Condorcet, who defined the entire history of humanity in terms of progress, and this in turn grew out of Turgot's earlier work. Condorcet was a royal official before the French Revolution, but he became deeply involved in the French Revolution. When a rival faction in the revolution came to power, Condorcet eventually became a hunted man. While he was living in safe houses and evading the authorities, he wrote a remarkable book that sets out a definitive statement of the Enlightenment philosophy of history, sketch for a historical picture of the progress of the human mind. Condorcet was eventually captured and thrown into prison and died under mysterious circumstances in prison. It's not known if he was poisoned by his jailers, took poison himself, or died of natural causes. Condorcet's sketch for a historical picture of the human mind, which is posthumously published in 1795, is divided into 10 sections, which Condorcet identified as an account of 10 epochs in the development of the human mind. Each of these epochs represents a stage in development and a threshold of development that has been attained in that stage. Condorcet wasn't the first to attempt this kind of speculative prehistory. Henry Home, Lord Kaimes in England, an elder contemporary of Condorcet, had done something similar in his Sketches on the History of Man from 1774, in which the whole of human history is decomposed into the 4 stages of foraging, pastoralism, agriculture, and trade integration. Kant had also done something similar in his Speculative Beginnings of Human History from 1786. Kant, like Condorcet, was more interested in the development of the human mind specifically than was Lord Kaimes in his history, but Kant's account was only a short paper. So with so many people treating it, it's obvious that this was a theme that interested the Enlightenment. We can think of it as the Enlightenment attempting to understand its own origins by tracing the development of the human mind through history. Condorcet's treatment of this theme is more elaborate and more detailed than either that to be found in Lord Kaimes or Kant. Condorcet begins his sketch for a historical picture of the progress of the human mind with a few paragraphs on epistemology, which is appropriate since Condorcet is seeking to write a history of the human mind, which is going to pervasively involve human knowledge. Quote, "This picture is historical. Since subjected as it will be to perpetual variations, it is formed by the successive observation of human societies at the different eras through which they have passed. It will accordingly exhibit the order in which the changes have taken place, explain the influence of every past period upon that which follows it, and thus show, by the modifications which the human species has experienced in its incessant renovation through the immensity of ages, the course which it has pursued and the steps which it has advanced toward knowledge and happiness. From these observations on what man has heretofore been and what he is at present, we shall be led to the means of securing and of accelerating the still further progress of which, from his nature, we may indulge the hope," unquote. The first of Condorcet's 10 epochs was tribalism. The second epoch is pastoralism transitioning into agriculturalism. The third epoch covers the period from agriculturalism to the invention of an alphabet, which implies written language. The fourth epoch is all about ancient Greece, which Condorcet treats as the origins of the sciences. The fifth epoch further discusses the development of science and philosophy, but Condorcet treats Rome as already the beginning of the end for ancient learning, and the fifth epoch ends with the decline of science. The sixth epoch is from the Dark Ages to the beginnings of the revival of learning at the time of the Crusades, according to Condorcet. The seventh epoch runs from the revival of learning to the invention of the printing press. The eighth epoch culminates in the dramatic overthrow of the yoke of oppression under which science had been laboring, according to Condorcet, and this seems to be equivalent in Condorcet to the scientific revolution. The ninth epoch takes us up to Condorcet's own time and discusses the work of his contemporaries. The 10th epoch is about the future progress of the human mind. Condorcet was one of the great advocates for what we know as the indefinite perfectibility of man. That is to say, the idea that humanity can continue to perfect itself indefinitely into the future. So, in other words, it's not a matter of we're going to perfect until we come to an end point at which we can't go any further, but human perfection can just keep adding and adding and adding further into the future. Arthur Lovejoy, whom I mentioned earlier, said of Condorcet's perfectibility, quote, "The term perfectibility, to which, though it was apparently invented by Turgot in 1750, Rousseau probably did more than anyone else to give currency, became the catchword of Condorcet and other subsequent believers in the reality, necessity, and desirability of human progress through a fixed sequence of stages in both past and future," unquote. This comes out most clearly in the final section of Condorcet's last work, which treats the future of the human mind. Part of what makes Condorcet's sketch so remarkable is how accurate he was in foreseeing the future of science. He acknowledged the human limitations to the human progress in science, saying that, quote, "Man can never know more than a part of the objects that the nature of his intelligence allows him to understand, and that he must in the end arrive at a point where the number and complexity of the objects he already knows have absorbed all his strength, so that any further progress must be completely impossible," unquote. So that implies that there are limits to human progress. But Condorcet argues that these limitations can be addressed by more precise scientific language, by improved taxonomies of knowledge, and especially making education available to everyone. He says, quote, "The human mind learns how to classify them and to subsume them under more general facts, and at the same time, the instruments and methods employed in their observation and their exact measurement acquire a new precision, since as more relations between various objects become known, man is able to reduce them to more general relations, to express them more simply, and to present them in such a way that it is possible to grasp a greater number of them with the same degree of intellectual ability and the same amount of application, since as the mind learns to understand more complicated combinations of ideas, simpler formula soon reduce their complexity. So truths that were discovered only by great effort and could only at first be understood by men capable of profound thought are soon developed and proved by methods that are not beyond the reach of common intelligence," unquote. And for several pages, Condorcet goes on sketching how all of these things can be done. And by and large, most of this was, in fact, done over the past quarter millennium since Condorcet was born. And much of that progress Condorcet imagined, well, happened more or less as he imagined it. Condorcet also attempts to see beyond this process of the development of knowledge and industry and to imagine the potential problems of the future society of maximized abundance on which these developments seem to be converging. And in doing this, he anticipated Malthus in an interesting passage. Quote, "With all this progress in industry and welfare, which establishes a happier proportion between man's talents and their needs, each successive generation will have larger possessions, either as a result of this progress or through the preservation of the products of industry. And so, as a consequence of the physical constitution of the human race, the number of people will increase. Might there not then come a moment when these necessary laws begin to work in a contrary direction, when the number of people in the world finally exceeding the means of subsistence, there will in consequence ensue a continual diminution of happiness and population, a true retrogression, or at best an oscillation between good and bad. In societies that have reached this stage, will not this oscillation be a perennial source of more or less periodic disaster? Will it not show that a point has been attained beyond which all further improvement is impossible, and that the perfectibility of the human race after long years arrived at a term beyond which it may never go," unquote. So like his earlier passage, when Condorcet suggests there are limits to the human mind, but then we can overcome them through scientific methods, here he's suggesting that even if we're successful in creating a very prosperous society, that people will outbreed the means of subsistence. So that's a classic Malthusianism. There's also a sense in which this passage anticipates what has come to be called the repugnant conclusion. The repugnant conclusion, also called the paradox of mere addition, was first formulated by Derek Parfit in 1984. Quote, for any possible population of at least 10 billion people, all with a very high quality of life, there must be some larger imaginable population whose existence, if other things are equal, would be better even though its members have lives that are barely worth living, unquote. A large literature on population ethics has already grown up around the repugnant conclusion, which incorporates a great many assumptions, including a lot of utilitarian presuppositions that don't even figure if you reject utilitarianism. But this has become a highly active area of philosophical research in recent decades, and it's worth noting that some of these problems in population ethics were already being anticipated in the 18th century. So in the passage I quoted, he not only mentions the problem of a population outrunning subsistence, means of subsistence, he also mentions a continual diminution of happiness. So the part of the repugnant conclusion is that if you grow the population enough, even if the happiness of each individual declines, if you might get a total, if you could measure the total amount of happiness, which is obviously inherently questionable, you might get a situation where you have billions upon billions of people living miserable lives, but they have just enough happiness that happiness of billions and billions of lives will exceed a smaller number in which everybody has a rather good life. And that is like I said, that's generated a significant literature over the past few decades since formulated by Parfit. Condorcet has an answer to this too, and it's more or less a question of moral progress keeping up with technical progress. Quote, before all this comes to pass, the progress of reason will have kept pace with that of the sciences, and that the absurd prejudices of superstition will have ceased to corrupt and degrade the moral code by its harsh doctrines. Instead of purifying and elevating it, we can assume by then men will know that if they have a duty toward those who are not yet born, that duty is not to give them existence, but to give them happiness. Their aim should be to promote the general welfare of the human race or of the society in which they live or the family in which they belong, rather than to foolishly encumber the world with useless and wretched beings. Unquote. So already there you can see an implied limitation of population so that people can lead better lives. As a man of the Enlightenment, Condorcet imagined the scientific method not only being applied to science, technology, and engineering, but also to metaphysics and morals. And with this coming scientifically driven progress in philosophy and morals, human beings would not only approximate perfection in knowledge, but we'd also indefinitely approximate perfection in the moral life. Condorcet also advocates for that familiar feature of Enlightenment universalism, a universal language. Since his time, many universal languages have been formulated, the most well-known among them probably being Esperanto, but none have caught on in a big way. But that seems to be a dream that doesn't go away. However, if we limit ourselves to science, and most of Condorcet's discussion is discussion of science, mathematics and metrology have become de facto universal languages for the sciences. So there is a sense in which we have even realized this dream of a universal language. In terms of metrology, the SI system of metric units is essentially a universal language among the sciences. Condorcet also imagines indefinitely extending the human lifespan, which is not something that you read about a lot in 18th century philosophy. So Condorcet was a man who you could say was straining at the limits of his time. And for him, the future, the progress that it promised, couldn't come soon enough. When I was reading Condorcet, strangely, one of the Beatitudes came to my mind. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Certainly, Condorcet was a man who thirsted after righteousness. It comes across in everything in this future of the human mind that he wrote. Of course, Condorcet denounced superstition and the terrors of religion throughout his sketch for a historical picture of the progress of the human mind. But it's the same thirst for righteousness, however we clothe it. At our present juncture in history, the thirst for righteousness is perhaps among the least understood and least appreciated facet of the human mind. After the disasters of the 20th century, it's become difficult for us to square these events with the thirst for righteousness. But this failure to understand what happened and what went wrong is a function of our moral parochialism. The thirst for righteousness has created what is best in human history, and it has been responsible for what is worst in human history. The two can't be separated. It was a thirst for righteousness, and often in the form that Condorcet imagined and embodied for a scientifically sophisticated future, that created the conditions of the 20th century that drove the worst atrocities. Montaigne had said as much about the 30 Years' War when he said that men, in trying to turn themselves into angels, instead transformed themselves into beasts. It was the same thirst for righteousness that led to a widespread revulsion toward the atrocities of the 20th century, much as Europe was repulsed by the violence of the 30 Years' War after the fact, after people had had enough of it. And the reaction against this bloodbath led to the Enlightenment that was ably represented by Condorcet. It's difficult to recapture the moral tenor of these times, but Condorcet and a few others give us a hint of what it was like. If you read the sermons of Joseph Butler, perhaps better known as Bishop Butler, among the greatest of English moralists and another elder contemporary of Condorcet, you'll find a moral theory that no one during or after the 20th century would have or could have conceived. As difficult as it is for us today to appreciate Butler's moral theory, Butler was probably closer to the truth of things than we are. Butler's view of human nature, which Condorcet shares in many ways, explicitly recognizes and builds on the thirst for righteousness. It's difficult for us today so readily to recognize the thirst for righteousness because we're living in the aftermath of a catastrophe, a manifestation of what Mircea Eliade called the terror of history, and it's left us dazed and confused. We have learned to our sorrow that the desire to be good is all too easily perverted and perhaps even more easily taken advantage of. And we haven't yet figured out what to do with that knowledge. Condorcet knew exactly what he wanted to do with the knowledge that the Enlightenment was producing, and he knew, or he thought he knew, exactly the future that this knowledge promised. Unfortunately, we can't be so confident either in our knowledge, what it means and what it portends, or in our future. But happy birthday, Condorcet, anyway, and thanks for listening.